So most of us are just a little over 24 hours away from going back to work and being called by God because of the renewal that's happening in us this weekend to do something to deepen the human effort in our work. So how do we do that? For those of you that are leaders, and that is most of us in this room, you need to understand that for an organization to be healthy and fully humanized, we need to have leaders activated at every level in an organization. This is not just the job of the leader at the top. The best definition I've ever come across as to what a leader is someone who creates a way for people to contribute in order to make something extraordinary happen. Leaders are people who create ways for people to contribute in order to make something extraordinary happen. And if you consider it deeply, that's exactly what Jesus did when he picked 12 knuckleheads to follow him around for 3.5 years. So I want to talk to you very crisply and cleanly in just the next 20 minutes or so about 2 simple ways in which you can humanize work. The first one is I want to start off by telling you a story. Many years ago in my career, I started off as a nurse. I worked in the emergency room. And most evenings, I loved coming to work, especially when one of the doctors was on call that night. There was one doctor in particular. He happened to be a Christ follower, although he didn't tell a lot of people that. But he had a way of causing all of us to contribute in a way that something extraordinary happened because we were a team. We were not just a collection of individual people, but he called the best out in each one of us. And I can guarantee you that when those of us who worked in the emergency room on a regular basis came to work and his name was on the board, we all knew the next 8 hours was going to fly by. Not only did he have to make us function together as a team, but what made him elevated to a new level of leadership is when a code got called on a patient. When somebody was in such a crisis that all departments in the hospital needed to respond, around that bed was not just the people from the emergency room, but somebody from laboratory, somebody from X-ray, somebody from respiratory therapy, people that we didn't know. And he had to make us function like a team. One of the things he would do is if there was a lull in the code and it was appropriate, he would ask those of us who were much less qualified than him what we might do next. He was constantly teaching. He would call us by name. He would thank people for getting the lab results back quickly. He would ask us, should I put a chest tube in now or should I push this drug or that drug? He made us feel like we were together. I remember one night working on a little kid. And boy, if you don't think the urgency doesn't go through the roof in a situation like that, and one moment we were waiting for some test results to come back before we decided what to do next, and he looked around the circle around the table and he said, we will save this kid. And man, I'll tell you, you could have heard a pin drop in that room, and we all just grabbed down to the lowest parts of our soul and brought another better version of us up and worked even harder together. I remember one night in particular around 8 o'clock on an evening shift when they brought a 24-year-old woman in. And it took us about 3 hours of working together before we had a determination whether we would send her to the morgue or up to the intensive care unit. The room looked like a bomb had gone off. There had been many tense moments when it wasn't looking good, but at the end of those 3 hours, we stabilized her enough. And a number of the nurses and respiratory therapists gathered around her gurney where there were tubes coming out all over, and they escorted her up the 4 floors to the intensive care unit. Housekeeping came in and cleaned the room. I hung back in the back and did what nurses do. I caught up on my notes and eavesdropped with the doctor and what he was saying to the intern. And I listened as the doctor that I admired so much began to debrief the 3-hour code with the intern that was working with him that night. And they spent about 20 minutes going over different procedures that they had done, different lab results, and how they had responded with medication and procedures. And my doctor that I loved working with coached the intern through each one of those decisions. And then, at the end of the 20 minutes, he said to the intern, did you notice the guy from housekeeping that came in at the end of the code and cleaned the room up? Well, you could tell immediately by the look on the intern's face that not only did he not notice the guy who had come in, he had no idea and was a bit annoyed as to why he was being asked this question. And I remember thinking, I'm not leaving this room even though my notes are done. So I did pretend writing. And I could tell immediately when the intern gave that look back, I wouldn't want to be you right now, buddy. And my doctor said to him, his name is Carlos. And then waiting for some response from the intern who held that same look on his face, he just pushed the knife in a little bit deeper and twisted it. He said, listen, Carlos is the best guy we have on our housekeeping team, and they're all good. But when Carlos comes in as part of our team, he cleans that room up faster than anybody, and everything gets put back exactly where it belongs, and you and I can treat another patient immediately because of the work Carlos does. Still, stupid blank stare. So my doctor said, Carlos's wife's name is Maria. They have 3 kids. He named them and the age of each child. And then he said, they came up from Mexico about 2 years ago. They live in a small apartment in Santa Ana, about 3 miles from here. And I remember thinking, oh, he's been there. And then, to sum up the whole debrief situation, he put his hand on the intern's shoulder and he said, when you and I work together next Tuesday, I want you come prepared to tell me something about Carlos that I don't already know. Yes. It was one of the most brilliant leadership moments I have ever observed. What I love about this story is Carlos didn't become a doctor. That's not the part of the story I'm here to tell you. Carlos, as far as I know, is still working in the housekeeping department of that hospital. It did not make any difference to that doctor. He treated Carlos like a member of the team, the same way he treated the intern, the nurses, the lab technicians. He opened his eyes and he saw the value that Carlos brought, that everybody else, often including the intern, not only overlooked, but actually dismissed. There was a personal connection with his doctor, with the people that worked around him that went above and beyond anything I had ever seen. And that event happened 32 years ago. I can still tell it like it happened yesterday. I was so stunned by his vision for other people. Now, this is very biblical, and you already knew that. Some of the things that we can do to humanize work is to really pay attention to what's going on in Scripture. And there are evidences of this kind of paying attention to small things all throughout the Bible. In Exodus chapter 35, Moses has been given by God directions on how to build the tabernacle. The people have left Egypt. They're on their way to the promised land. They don't know, it's going to take them a little bit longer than they thought. And before they have a permanent place of worship, God allows them to use some of the things that they brought out of Egypt and some of the woods that they found and the precious metals to create a portable sanctuary, a tabernacle. And everybody in the community is given a job. And in Exodus chapter 35, all the materials for the tabernacle are laid out, and people are given assignments. Some people have the job when they stop and pause and the tabernacle needs to go up, that they're supposed to bring the gold, the silver, the bronze. Some of them are supposed to bring the hides of sea cows. Some of them the incense. Some of them the gems that are on the breastpiece. You get the picture. All the amazing, beautiful things that make the tabernacle put together. Everybody's got in their bags and they bring it together and they construct it. And right in the middle of all this, with no commentary at all, in chapter 35, in verse 17, it mentions the curtains of the courtyard. Somebody has the posts and the bases, the curtain for the entrance, the tent pegs for the tabernacle and their ropes, the woven garments worn for the priests, the tent pegs and the ropes. Now, when Moses is listing out all the beautiful things of the tabernacle and you get stuck with the job to bring the bag full of the tent pegs and the ropes, you don't feel very special. But guess what? If everybody else brings the beautiful, opulent pieces and you don't show up with the tent pegs and the ropes, guess what doesn't go up? The tabernacle. And from the very beginning of Scripture, and there are even passages before Exodus chapter 35, God is reminding us to look in the small places for the very, very important things. One of the ways that you and I as Christ followers humanize the workplace is we begin to replace our vision with God's vision, and that is the ability to see great things in small things. One other passage that so beautifully exemplifies this is in Zechariah and Haggai, and these passages come at a time when Israel has been dispersed. So if you remember the history of Israel, it goes into a slant going up and to the right. It spotlights in the time of David when he is just a great king and everything is built under him. The temple, Israel is flourishing because the temple is not just the center of worship in Israel. It's the center of economics, of healthcare, of education. It is the centralized function of their entire community, and the nation is flourishing under David. With Solomon, it continues to rise, and then it starts to fall. And Israel's enemies see points of vulnerability in that fall, and they come in, and there is a Babylonian captivity when the nations of Israel are dispersed and taken captive. And that goes on for scores and scores of years. And you remember in Isaiah and Jeremiah, God tells the people, while you are pulled out of your promised land, while you are now a people living in another culture, what I want you to do is put down roots, to build homes, to have children, and to pray for the good of the city, to contribute to a culture other than yours while you are in dispersal. This was not what they wanted to hear. And then at the end of that time, the first wave of refugees leaves Babylon and goes back to Israel. And where they are most excited to go is to see the temple, because in these scores of years they're in Babylon, the older people are telling the younger people, they're describing what the temple looked like and what Israel was like in its peak, when the temple was the center of all the activity of the nation. And these younger generations would listen with bated breath. And then they went back in waves. And it says when the first group came back, in Haggai chapter 2, it says that the first group of them went to where the temple used to be. And it had been destroyed during their years away. And all that was left was the thin outline of the foundation in the grass of the temple. Here's what's fascinating, because in the book of Haggai, it says the word of the Lord comes to his people. And you'd think at a time like this that God would be a little heavy on the encouraging side, okay? These people have been through a lot. They've been telling the younger generations what it used to be like. They're coming back from being captives. They're ready to rebuild. They see all that's left. Their spirits are low. And here's what God says. Who of you left around here looking at the foundation of the temple is left that saw it in its former glory? How does it look to you now? You could have done a little bit better than that. Does it not seem to you like nothing? He is really driving home the point that everything appears to be lost. It's worse than they thought. And then God switches gears and he says three things that are powerfully profound to this moment of very small things where God is beginning something new. Now he says, be strong and work, for I am with you. Have eyes that see the possibilities in these small and destroyed things, because God is doing a work of renewal. Count on my power and your work and my presence. The next book over in Zechariah, the same thing is happening, and the people are discouraged because all that's left is the foundation. And God says, when Zerubbabel, who has been appointed to rebuild the temple, comes to you with the plumb line in his hand, get excited and rejoice. Now, how many of you in here have ever done a remodeling job on a room, on a house, anything? Raise your hand. If you're like me, and I enjoy doing that kind of thing, there are points of excitement. When you're first deciding how you're going to design it, you're drawing it out on the back of a napkin or a piece of paper. When you meet with either an architect or a contractor who can take that mess and actually put it into a form that looks like, oh, that's it, that's what I want. When they first tear something down or put new drywall up, or they bring the paint chips and the carpet, those are points of excitement. I have never once gotten excited when the plumb line comes. It's just not a point of excitement for me. What God is saying here is even when something as small as somebody coming with a leveler, because a plumb line just does what a leveler does horizontally, a plumb line does it vertically. When even that little tiny piece of work begins, I want your soul's response to be one of rejoicing. And then a verse that you're probably all familiar with, do not despise the day of small things. One of the first and most significant things we can do when it comes to humanizing work is like that emergency room director. We can change our vision to see things like God does. and see them in a way where we see God's goodness and greatness and future in very small things and in people. And then the second thing that we can do to humanize work, and this may be a little counterintuitive, but it's actually the work of conflict in the workplace. If there is one word I would use to describe conflict to both our own personal spiritual formation and to the health of an organization, it is this: necessary. I had a conversation with a woman in our church a couple of years ago. We were talking about an older man in our church that we both really love. And I said to her, Kathy, I really love him. Why do you love him? And she said, oh, I love him because he reminds me of Jesus. I said, I love him, but he doesn't remind me of Jesus. Why does he remind you of Jesus? And I'll never forget what she said. She says, it's because he's so sweet and nice all the time. I said, are you talking about the same Jesus I'm talking about? I said, Kathy, get a piece of paper out and draw a line down the middle and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And every time Jesus says something really sweet, like you're beautiful, don't ever change, let's do lunch, put a tick on the left-hand side of the page. And every time he says something that I would give my kids a timeout for saying, like you're not worthy of the crumbs I brush off the table to feed the dogs, put a little tick on the right side and take a guess as to which side of the paper is going to fill up faster. Jesus was a walking defining moment. He was good and kind many times, and he was harsh and critical and got to the heart of the issue and turned the knife. And there is something about the right use of conflict over time that really transforms people into being more human. And you can only humanize your workplace if the individuals in it are becoming more human. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago in my consulting practice, one of my partners and I were working with a company, not a Christian company. The reason I remember them is it was 2008, during the middle of the recession. They were one of our only clients that had actually grown about 35%. They were a young startup company. They were going like gangbusters. And what happens when you're a consultant is by lunchtime on the first day of the offsite, everybody has pulled you aside separately to tell you who the problem on the team is, and it's never them. In 10 years of consulting, I've never had anybody say, it's me. By lunch, my partner Kent and I met and talked, and we said, we're clear, it's Lisa. Everybody has told us Lisa is the problem on the team. Well, part of the problem is people need a scapegoat, and they perceive that it's only one person, but you know it's a whole system. So we spent the first day of the offsite going over the 5 dysfunctions of a team, the Myers-Briggs, how you build a cohesive leadership team. And on the second day, we spent the day working on vision, strategy, and mission, and how you integrate a healthy team with the vision, mission, and strategy of the organization. In the middle of a discussion on strategy, Lisa was talking. Steve, the youngest guy on the team, 32 years old, was wiggling around in his chair, and I thought, he just looks like a volcano that's getting ready to explode. The day before, we had talked about one of the dysfunctions of a team is the inability to handle conflict and how you need to get really good at handling conflict. So while Lisa was talking, he interrupted her in the middle of this strategic discussion and just blurted out, Lisa, you're a jerk and you never get your work done on time. I'm like, oh, no, not quite that. And I'm freezing thinking, I don't know what to say. My partner Kent stands up very slowly and says, well, that was really interesting. Let's think about that. And then this is what he does. With a red pen, he writes on the flip chart, Lisa, you're a jerk. Just in case anybody had forgotten what just got said, and you never get your work done on time. I'm thinking we're going to get fired. We're not even going to be able to finish out the day, and they're not going to pay us. And then Kent said, in what I think is a stroke of brilliance, these are 2 completely separate issues. I'm guessing already, this is Kent talking, I'm guessing already that Steve has thought about 3 different ways he could have said that better. But what I'm afraid is going to get lost is the issue. So if you will bear with me, he said, we're going to get back to this in just about 15 or 20 minutes, but I want to start with the issue. Does Lisa get her work done on time? Well, he had them with eye contact for just a minute, and as soon as he asked this question, they all went back and looked at their toes. So he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he simply said, we're going to start with you, and I want one word. I want a yes or a no. I don't want a caveat, an explanation, or a story. He made everybody in that circle go around and say yes or no. Do you know every person except one person on the team said, it's true, she's not getting her work done on time. And I think that one person was Lisa's BFF. And just mistakenly thought it would be a good idea to protect her. It's not a good idea. Guess who wants to talk at this point? Lisa. And if you had been there with me, you would have seen the look on her face was somewhere between furious, humiliated, and devastated. And here's what she said. First of all, I cannot believe that you waited until we had two strangers in the room to bring this up. Second of all, I can tell by the way you're looking at each other that every single one of you has talked about this. Now we're starting to unpack the system issue. It wasn't just Lisa. This was a problem that they had talked about, but nobody had talked directly to Lisa. We have a saying in our church that actually just started a month ago because our senior pastor said, let's start talking to people and not about them. If I wasn't so old, I would tattoo that somewhere on my body, but I'm afraid I have to lift my skin up to read it, so I'm not going to do it. Let's talk to people and not about them. So one person on the team, in a really well-intended gift of mercy, I think, said, Lisa, is there something going on at home we don't know about? Now, at first blush, that sounds really nice, and I'm just sitting there thinking, you waited a year to ask that? A year. Because she said, Lisa, up until about a year ago, you were just one of our top performers. And Lisa said, no, there's nothing going on at home. You want to know what's happened? In the last year, every single one of you, your departments have grown by 35%. You're handing me a third more work than you used to, and I'm dying. So Lisa is not asking for help when she needs it. Ooh, anybody in here been in that position? I have. There's system issues all around here. As you can imagine, we solved this problem pretty quickly because they were growing so fast they could hire somebody to help Lisa. They began to realize you don't talk about somebody behind their back, you go to them. Lisa began to realize it's not a position of strength to just keep trying harder when you're drowning. It's okay to raise your hand up and say you need help. We're getting all kinds of resolution, and people are growing up like in spades all over the room in these 20 minutes, and this is not even a Christian organization. And then imagine when we went back to this issue, how much power had gone out of the way it got said. You got to give people permission to do something poorly in order to do it well. We gave Steve permission to do it poorly. And then we came back to this, and he stood up immediately, and he said, I'll take it from here. And he looked right at Lisa, and he said, first of all, I need to apologize. And I'll never forget, he said, if my mother was here, I would be in so much trouble. And I wanted to say, what makes you think you are not in any trouble right now? And then he said to Lisa, let me rephrase it. I find myself increasingly frustrated when I come into work every day, and everybody else has their work done, but you don't. If you can't hear that kind of feedback, you don't deserve to be on a leadership team. Feedback, Brene Brown says, is a sign of respect. I respect you enough to consider you an adult, to consider that you're strong enough to take what I need to say to you, to give you feedback. So I would ask you to consider as a Christ follower to really lean in both to having the vision to see God in the smallest things in your company and in your workplace and call them out. Pay attention to them. Fan that little flame. And then to consider how comfortable and good you are at dealing with conflict as a way to really pull out the very best in other people and therefore in organizations. Thank you.